This is the second studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. The two of us are partners at the office and, of course, hosts of the show. And today our guest is Morris Adjmi.
Morris is the founder and principal of MA, a multidisciplinary office based in New York City. They do planning, architecture, interior, and art curation.
They do everything. And with Morris, we talk about where he's from, how he first became interested in architecture, and him building very unsafe structures as a kid, as an early interest, I guess, in eventually architecture. Him studying it, him working and alongside Aldo Rossi, having an office with Aldo Rossi, him founding his own office, his design philosophy and principles, running an office, all that good stuff, and of course, favorite buildings at the very end of the recording. I think the conversation was a lot of fun, and you guys are definitely going to enjoy it. Sponsors.
Would you like to get Asbirds faster?
Yes.
Okay. IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan-to-BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Once a building scan is complete, IPX delivers detailed BIM, CAD, 360 virtual tours, and material takeoffs in their platform, where you can view, share, export, query, and quantify areas, floors, and materials. Check out the IPX link in our show notes. Managing design projects and specifications can be challenging, but Programma makes it effortless. Trusted by top interior design firms in over 75 countries, it's the world's most elegant software for interior designers. With its suite of powerful tools, you will experience smoother client interactions with less back and forth, saving you hours of admin work and making your job more enjoyable. Stop struggling and start thriving with the seriously powerful Programma. Click the link in our show notes and get 25% off an annual subscription with code SECONDSTUDIO at checkout. You will wonder how you ever worked without it.
This is the second studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Morris. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Morris Adjmi, and I grew up in New Orleans, and I grew up in a house by the lake, with my parents, 3 brothers and sisters, and a dog.
Nice. Was there anything, now that you are a well-established architect, you've had this fantastic career, looking back, was there anything about where you grew up, the town or the home itself, that, I don't know, was architectural or did something to plant the seeds of you becoming an architect?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I don't know if this is true, but I feel like if I hadn't grown up in New Orleans, I might not have become an architect. I think that...
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think my earliest memory, well, I have 2 very early memories related to architecture. One, which I think shows my desire to build and to create with semi-disastrous results, and one just really set me on a course to be who I am. The first one was when I was, I think, about 6 years old. My mother was not home. She was a stay-at-home mom, and she was always very present. And she really pushed me along to eventually push me along to follow my passion, my career. But she wasn't home at the time, and I was with a babysitter at the time. And I'd essentially taken every piece of furniture in the house that I could move and built a pyramid in the center of our living room, made out of like these folding tables that clip together and boxes and just any scrap of quote unquote building material that I could find. And I remember vividly being at the apex, the top of the pyramid, reaching for the ceiling. My mother's coming in the front door, and the whole thing just collapsed. Just like,
oh my,
into a pile of rubble. I caught the edge of my head near my eye on one of the sharp edges of the table. Blood started flying all over the place. And the next thing I know, I was in the hospital getting stitches, looking up at the doctor stitching my eye up. I still have a little scar from it. So That's like sort of my earliest memory of trying to create a structure.
Wow.
So you got your babysitter fired, right?
Yeah, probably. I don't remember exactly, but I remember my father coming in the room. It was just like a whole, a lot of attention. Maybe I liked all the attention, so I kept doing it. But and then I think the next image, or sort of best way to describe my attraction to architecture is I remember in about third grade, I think it was third grade, I was about 8 years old, eight, probably nine, something like that, going to the French Quarter. And I was, in French Quarter a lot. We'd go for to Cafe Du Monde for coffee and donuts. But the teacher had taken us down there, and the assignment was really to draw what we saw, anything. And I kept drawing the balconies and the grill work that you see attached to these structures in the French Quarter, which are sort of a mix of French and Spanish architecture. And it was at that point that she said, "Do you know about the orders of architecture and how they're different? It's a different language," and really started talking to me about it. And that's when I really started to think about how all of these pieces were put together and how they all related to both a history and a consistency of architecture that you saw throughout the city.
I like that. Wait, so this exercise, this kind of class assignment, when was this? Was this when you were in like elementary school or high school? Or?
Yeah, I was about 8.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very
So
early.
it was
That's really
kind of early, So,
yeah.
And then I think the next sort of moment or time when I started to be more focused on the idea of being an architect as a profession or as a career was in high school. I took a lot of art classes. I was always drawing and sketching and photographing. And we took a test in I think 10th or 11th grade, that sort of was supposed to inform us as to what we would, what we were best suited to do. And mine came up photographer or architect. And so, I loved photography. I was like the school, photographer. And, I started to think like which one of those directions I want to be in. There was a class called environmental design that I really liked. And I talked to the teacher, who was a painter. And he sort of coached me and said, if you want to go into architecture, you should pursue that early because it's harder to get into architecture school it's harder to get in and easy to get out if you decide you don't like it. And so that's what I sort of did. I applied to architecture school and sort of didn't look back.
It's amazing. One of the things I found with architecture is it's the way architects think about it is oftentimes very different from what the general public thinks about architecture or what architects do.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, back when you were in high school, did you know what an architect did? Did someone tell you what it was going to be like? And usually also the conceptual side of architecture is not really known by non-architects.
Yeah, I think I also wonder if it was now or say even 20 years ago, would I have gone into architecture? I like the tactile connection of the hand to a pencil to a piece of paper, like drawing and being able to create something with your hands, and the feeling of actually doing that, and all of the tools that architects use, the rapidograph or pencil that you're sharpening, and all of those tools, which don't really exist anymore. And we could talk a little bit about that maybe as we get on. But I think that if it was a computer, I don't know if I would have been as interested. That feels so abstract to me. But I also, just in terms of like understanding what an architect did, My father really wasn't supportive. As I said, my mother was very supportive, but my father was, he was in business, and he sort of wanted me to do what he did. So he set up a lunch with one of his friends who was an architect, who tried to convince me to not become an architect. And he said, it's a horrible profession. It's really hard, and this and that. And I'm like, but that's what you do. Why are you trying to convince me not to do it? And I think it was good that I had reached a certain level of stature or accomplishment before my father passed away, because I think he was happy in the end of what I did. But when it came time to make that decision, he was a little reluctant, but he did support it eventually.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the kind of running jokes, as you've probably heard, is that if you are an architect and you have kids, everyone asks, are your kids going to be architects? And most architects will say, jokingly, but sometimes not jokingly, no.
Right. Well, I do have 3 kids, and I thought they totally didn't care about architecture, and about 2 years ago, one of my sons went to RISD for the pre-college program, and I had gotten him a job, and or not, I didn't get him a job, but I introduced him to an artist, and he was working summers and after school as a gallery, as a studio assistant. And he was very passionate about drawing and painting, and I thought he was going to go into fine arts. And then about a week before this program, he said, I think I'm going to go into architecture. And I did a double take. I was like, what? Where did that come from? And he's now a freshman studying architecture. Wow. So yeah, I completely didn't. I mean, they were aware of what I did. And I took them from when they were young to job sites, but I have 3 kids. 2 of them could care less, and one of them seems like he wants to pursue architecture. So,
oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I feel like with architecture, I think for some people it's truly their calling, and I think for a lot of people, once you get introduced to it, and you, like in school, let's say, you realize how expansive that universe is, and there's just so many questions, so many different avenues you can go down, that it really becomes, for a lot of people, they get sucked into it, because once you see all these possibilities and all these questions, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think that there's has been and continues to be a huge shift in young people's perception about what their place is. And I think architecture is a really great entry point if you're concerned about the environment or sustainability or any of those issues, wellness. You can enter it through architecture, and you can really make a difference, providing housing or helping to reduce our fossil fuel consumption. So I think that is different from the idea of just creating beautiful things, which obviously we want to do as well.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. I recall I was on a review, like a student presentation review panel, I don't know, a few years ago. And it had been some time since I had done one of those. And I was surprised that, I think this was a second-year studio, undergraduate, so they're young. But like 9 out of 10 students, their primary concerns were all the things you mentioned. And it was so different from 15 years before that. That was not really the conversation. The conversation was form or whatever else, right?
Right. And I think it's a portal for all of those things.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No. I was just going to say, it's just fascinating to see the shift. And I think that's a really good point, that it's an entry. It's one way, a very powerful way to think about these issues and to solve them, to address them.
Yeah. And I think these are all issues that have been topical since let's just say the 60s and certainly in the 70s. Equity and the environment, and they manifest themselves in a way that we can actually hopefully make a difference, as opposed to just protesting them, which obviously becomes the sort of entry point or the beginning of trying to find a way to correct things that have been going astray.
Yeah. Yeah. So you took that test in high school.
Yep.
You had 2 tracks and you chose architecture. So did you end up doing an undergraduate degree in architecture and then a master's, or how did that happen?
I did a master's program from the beginning at Tulane, but I had a little bit of a circuitous path because I studied at Tulane and then decided that I wanted, because I grew up in New Orleans, and I guess I wasn't really ready to leave when I applied to Tulane. I applied to a couple other schools, but I decided to stay in New Orleans. But after about the third year, or during the third year, I started getting antsy, and I felt like I was ready to travel. And I went to the dean's office, and I said, I'd like to think about junior year abroad, which was a 4th year. And they're like, well, we only have a few spaces at the AA, and there was also a program in Madrid, but there were no places available. And so I was like walking out, and they said, but there is something called the independent study if you want to apply for it. And I said, that sounds interesting. What does that mean? He said, well, you design your studies, and then make a proposal. And if we like the proposal, then you can follow that course. And so as I was walking out, there was a poster for the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And Aldo Rossi was one of the professors there. And there was a photograph of the Teatro Mondo, which is a project I really liked because I felt like it was this modern intervention in a historic city. It related to the environment. It wasn't really limited by the architecture. It celebrated, but I think it was still a modern statement. It was a meeting place, a theater. It celebrated this concept of floating theaters, which had been around since the 1500s, even a little earlier in Venice. And so I just like all those things spoke to me. And so I was like, I should go to the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And they had something called the Advanced Design Workshop. And a lot of the people that were going there were putting their portfolios together for grad school. And so I applied there, they accepted me, and then that was my proposal to go there. And they accepted the proposal for 6 months. But then I got there and I was like, I'm not going back now. It's like I barely know how to use the subway and where the cool places are. And I was hanging out at all these, clubs and staying up, till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, working on projects, and then going out after. And it was just like I was free,
Yeah.
So I just stayed. And then they're like, well, we may not give you all your credits. And I was like, well, I'll deal with that when it happens. And then the following summer, I had gone to Italy, and I stopped by Aldo's office, and they said, look, we're doing this competition. There were only 3 people in the office at the time for a housing block in Berlin. Can you help us with the model? And I was like, well, I could stay back around for 3 weeks, and then I'll hang out, and then I'll continue on. And they ended up winning the competition. And so I said, well, and they said, if you want to stay and work, you can. So I said, you know what? This is a great opportunity. I should definitely do that. So I went back to New Orleans, and the dean's office kept calling me and saying, you need to come register for next semester. And I wasn't planning to go back. So I was sort of avoiding going to register. And I kept saying, well, I'm waiting for my credits for last year because I want to make sure I get all my credits before I tell them. And then also before, so I know exactly what's happening. I didn't want to lose the credits, and I also didn't want to tell them I was going yet. So anyway, a friend of mine had told a professor or something, and I get a call from the dean's office, and they're like, Morris, you need to come in to see the dean. And I was like, okay. And I walk in, and it was the dean that had just started, Ron Filson. I didn't even know him because I was away when he started. And he said, hi, Morris. I said, hello. And he said, I heard you want to go to Italy. And I was, yes. And he said, I think it's a great idea. I was like, what? He said, yeah. Do you think Aldo will come do a lecture here? I'm like, if that's the deal, I'm sure I can convince him to come.
Nice.
So he said, well, what were you thinking? I was like, I was thinking of going for a semester, coming back and finishing my thesis. He says, why don't you go for a year and then come back and finish your thesis out of sequence? And I was like, okay. So that's what I did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So for a moment, you're like, who leaked this information to you that
really.
I wanted to go to?
Yeah.
So the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies was in, I might have missed it, it was in Italy?
No, it was in New York. It was,
okay.
It was founded by Philip Johnson and Peter Eisenman. And, Rem Koolhaas was there, and Ken Forrester was there, and Ken Frampton, and Tony Vidler. It was just a tremendous, center for what was happening at the time. They had an exhibition program, lecture program, and what I did was it was the history of architecture, theory of architecture, and then the studio workshop, which there were like 20 students and 4 professors. So
wow.
Charles Gwathmey was there, Bob Stern was there, and Stiana Agreste was there. So those were the first 4 professors. It was great. It was an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, that's I'm envious. That doesn't exist anymore, right?
No. It was I think there for about 12 years. I was kind of like maybe in the middle after about 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years. They had a magazine, a quarterly called Oppositions, which MIT Press did. I worked on a couple of those issues. They're doing mostly just mock-ups for the covers and layouts with them. It was great. It was really a tremendous opportunity. We did 2 projects in New York. So they really gave me sort of a sense of what it was like to build in the city, and sort of was a preview of what we do now.
That's amazing. And just for some kind of timeline, what years was this in New York?
That was 1980.
Okay. So also probably pretty rough in the city, depending on where you were at.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, it was great. They hadn't even sort of gentrified, or whatever we want to call it, Times Square yet. So it was really rough there. Meatpacking was still, sex workers and, clubbers going down there. The subways were completely covered with graffiti. We, I don't know if I should even talk. We used to shoot rockets out the window. We were in an office building overlooking Bryant Park. We were like on the 20th floor. And we literally were used to shoot Estes model rockets out the window, like at like 2-3 o'clock in the morning. And if they landed in the street, we would go pick them up. But if they went into the park, we were like, "There's no way we're going in there." But
that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's a funny story. It's also really, really hard to imagine. One of the offices I worked at was right at Bryant Park, and I'd look out at it every day.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine Bryant Park being a place that you feel unsafe going to, or anyone shooting rockets down there. I mean, it's...
Yeah, it was rough. It was really rough.
So, in that school, was that when you were first introduced to Aldo Rossi?
I had been reading about him, and like his interest in typology was something that resonated for me. I ended up doing my thesis on New Orleans housing types, really trying to understand more how the historic architecture could be a tool for designers, and not just a clip clipping opportunity for stylistic
Yeah.
embellishments. So I kind of tried to break that down and understand how the French and Spanish typologies were different from the American or the English typologies, and the primary difference is really the corridor. All of the French and Spanish housing was like room to room, whether it was a cottage, a shotgun, a townhouse, or even a bigger, plantation house, for example.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we're sort of in the 80s. That I think was sort of the heyday of postmodernism, if I'm not mistaken. Was that part of this scene? I mean, it sounds like your thesis was either in that space or touching on that space.
Yeah, I think that was certainly probably the heyday, of postmodernism. I think that my interest now was in sort of the continuity of architecture and restitching what we do to the history of architecture, but not really distorting the forms, in a postmodern way. I think that's a subtle difference, but I think it's an important difference because, having lived in Milan for a couple of years, and experiencing how that city was rebuilt after the war, you can see there's a continuity to the architecture, and the new architecture feels consistent in a way, but very different from the historic architecture. And it all plays nice together. And I think that's sort of what we try to do, and not create, look at me buildings, which I think is really prevalent now. And, I don't know if we want to go on a tangent, but there's a cartoon which I think was in the New Yorker, and I can't find it, but I keep saying I'm going to find it. It's a view looking south down Fifth Avenue, and the park is on the right. And on every block, there's a Guggenheim Museum marching down south. And I think that's, sort of where we are now. Every building wants to be like the star and, shout as loud as it can for attention. And, I think great cities are made by great buildings that can be background buildings. That doesn't mean that every building should be a background building, but there needs to be a balance, or I feel there needs to be a balance, and one where buildings can contribute to the overall fabric, but not necessarily overpower each other and vying for attention.
That's an incredibly good point, and I think it's depending on the architect, right? It's the difference between having a more urban perspective, a bigger perspective, frankly, and then one that's focused just of like, I'm within my property boundary, and that's my focus, and what it looks like in a photograph is my focus,
right? And
I don't really care, about anything else because I have my mission that I need to see through, or my statement I want to make, kind of like you're saying, and they're very different things. It kind of reminds me, there's you would know Marina better than me, but there's a neighborhood in Paris where your school is.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a neighborhood that was built in a relatively short period of time, and all the buildings are contemporary and modern. And all of them on their own, they're not like great architecture, but they're not bad either. Oh. But it just, when you walk through that neighborhood, maybe some French people get offended by this, it's kind of a shit show.
Right.
Because everything is just like trying to be a little something, and it's too much.
It's one neighborhood on the kind of like on the on the edge of Paris that used to be the meatpacking district. So it was like filled with big warehouse buildings, right? Most of them were completely demolished. So it was kind of like this blank slate neighborhood that needed to be brought back to life, and that's kind of somewhat of an issue when there is no context or the context is too far. Is that what do you start with?
Right.
And that neighborhood kind of, they did some interesting things in terms of urban design, kind of like thinking about the open block where it's mostly just pedestrian access and no cars, but kind of like having buildings scattered in different parts of the blocks, which I thought was pretty interesting. But the architectural language was a little bit too chaotic and, there is no continuity between the buildings, which felt a little bit like where am I?
It's placeless.
Yeah. When was this built?
That's a good question. I think
20 years ago.
My school finished a building there it used to be scattered in 5 different sites, and I think we moved in 2006 or something like that.
Yeah.
So the neighborhood was still under construction, around maybe up until 2015.
Is that near the Giacometti studio?
It's along the Seine, a little further down from the big library.
Right.
Like the four towers.
Yeah.
The one.
Yeah. There is some interesting buildings, but it's just it's a
As a
neighborhood
city
that
experience,
lacks a
feels
soul.
weird.
Especially when you're in Paris, you would not expect to
One of
find
the most
a
beautiful
neighborhood like
cities
that. Right.
on the planet. I think and I have a book on Hausman's sort of conventions for how the buildings were organized, where the balconies, where you had full-length balconies, where you had individual balconies, the base, the center, the top. And all of those things were prescriptive about an approach, but not specific about a style. And I think that really, that consistency reads whether you are an architect or someone who is not tuned into architecture, but I think you feel it. And I think that gives you this continuity and this sense of sort of balance and organization that I think makes the city feel really great.
Yeah. And that's one of the things about your work that's always been, I feel like that's been consistent, if I'm not mistaken, kind of throughout your career. That's been an aspect of architecture that you've always looked at very closely and intently.
Yeah. And I think that, what we try to, a good friend of mine, Bill Higgins, who's a landmarks consultant here in New York, described our buildings as being a grid starting with a grid and a conversation. And, I think that was really astute and sort of was a great way to describe what we do, because I think the grid for me is something that becomes sort of the structure or the organizing principle, but it just starts there. And then the conversation is the dialogue with the city, with the cultural history, with the site conditions. And that sort of resonated with, I think, the way I've continued to build the practice.
Yeah. That actually, I think you might have answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which I had written down, which was, to my eye, and of course, let me know if I'm reading everything wrong. Like also a lot of your work, it seems like you are working with the primary structural, sometimes actual structural and sometimes maybe not, but the primary elements of the architecture to create the expression of it, as opposed to, I don't know, let's say you have the structure of the building and you slap on kind of a facade that looks cool, and maybe it does look cool, but I think it seems to be you're playing with the primary elements, and expressing it through those, which I think is. But at the same time, there's a in some of the project there's a playfulness to it. There's a levity to it. It's not stark and severe always.
Yeah, and I think that's important to do both of the things that you described, is to use the structure, to celebrate it, but then also have it do double duty.
I will say that one of the buildings I'm most familiar with, just because, again, I lived in New York for a period of time, and I like a lot, is the Scholastic building.
Thanks.
Because one, I'd walk by it like every day,
right,
and it was there. But it's, I think, and this comment can be applied to many of your projects. But it does such a good job of, like we're just talking about, contributing to the context and enhancing that larger experience, but still being a unique building that you can look you can appreciate as a standalone building. I've yet to decide whether or not I like the front or the back better, because they're both really interesting facades.
Well, yeah, and I have a lot to talk about as far as that project goes. That project is really dear to me for a number of reasons, but it was one of the first major new buildings in that historic district, the Soho Cast Iron Historic District. I did that with Aldo Rossi. He died in a car accident about a week after that project was approved, got its final approval, and had to get approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission and then by the Board of Standards and Appeals. And so I sort of shepherded that project through. But I look at that project as kind of the foundation for what we do. It taught me how to approach context. Paul Goldberger in the Times at the time, when the building was finished, described it as a building that would teach a generation of architects how to build in historic context. And it certainly did that for me, and really became the foundation or the basis for how we work. Talking about the two facades, I think that's really highlights this contextual approach, because one could look at that building and say, you have one building that has two facades and they're both completely different. I mean, they are different in terms of the rendering, but they're the same in terms of the organization, into 3 bays wide and then 2 stories high. One uses round columns and beams, the other uses an arch motif. But both of those facades respond to their streets. The Broadway facade has a more monumental, classical sort of character, although it's very modern. Maybe even mannerist a term could be used to describe it. And the backside is a more industrial side. But I think a great story that most people don't know about the building is we were working on the building and we had spent all the time on the Broadway facade. And the back really was sort of like this blah, just grid. It was competent, I would say. And Aldo had come back in town, and he always was just drawing. Like, he was just constantly, like, if he didn't have something to do, then even if he had something to do, he was, drawing. And it was a Friday afternoon, and he kept complaining about the back facade. He said, we could do better than this. We could do, this is not really great, And then he started sketching this facade. It was yellow. He was using watercolors. I remember it was like bright yellow, and with these arches, these metal industrial arches. And he said, "Marks, come over here. Come over here." He goes, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Whoa!" I was like, "I think it's great. I love it, but we're presenting this project on Tuesday." It's like, how can we change? We've been to like dozens of meetings with the Landmarks Commission, with community boards, with neighbors, with elected officials. I mean, and so I was like, I didn't want to say no, but I was like, so I called up Bill Higgins, who I mentioned earlier, and luckily he picked up the phone. It was like Friday at 5:00 or something. I was like, "Bill, I think you need to come to the office." And we were like, on 20th Street in Flatiron, and he was down in Soho. And I was like, he's like, "Well, what's up?" I said, "Aldo's in town, and he has some ideas about the facade." He goes, he's like, "I'll be right over," kind of thing.
Yeah, he knows the drill.
And, he spoke a little Italian as well. And, Aldo gave him his whole, speech about why this was the right solution and everything. And he said something like "Magnifico" or something. He said, "Aldo, I love it." And so Aldo looks at me like, "See, I told you," kind of thing. And I'm like, okay, so now it's Friday. We've got to build a new model. We have to do all these drawings, and which we did, and we changed the entire facade. And we presented it, and it was approved at that hearing, which is not typical. It was
Yeah.
approved the same day we presented it. And I mean, this was a 10-story building, filling a gap tooth, because it was a 1-story building between these two very tall buildings. And those are the kind of things that you learn working with a master that cannot be taught. The idea that, it's never too late to do the right thing, or you need to do the right thing when something's not right, make it right, and not accept, mediocrity or just, okay, and really go for it. And that really, that I learned a tremendous amount from Aldo, about architecture, certainly. But I would say like the most valuable lessons I learned from him were really about conviction, dealing with, difficult situations or clients, and, really sticking with, to your convictions.
No, that's an amazing story. That's an amazing story.
I got tons of
Friday
Aldo
late
stories.
afternoon.
I have tons of Aldo stories, so might have to save those for a part 2 or something. But
That sounds good. That sounds good.
And now a little break for our show sponsors.
Revit users, you have access to a powerful new capability you might not know about. Available with Revit version 2023.1 onward, Autodesk Insight is a next-generation carbon analysis tool that can help you make the leap toward low-carbon design. With only a few clicks, Insight lets you analyze, understand, and track the embodied and operational carbon impact of your design choices. You can then visualize opportunities for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation with its flexible dashboards, helping you make more sustainable and informed decisions. Check out the Insight link in our show notes to learn more. This episode of The Second Studio is brought to you by BQE Core, the all-in-one firm management software built for architects. Designed by architects for architects, Core helps you track time effortlessly, manage projects seamlessly, and get paid faster, so you can focus on design, not spreadsheets. With powerful automation and real-time insights, it's everything you need to run a smarter and more profitable firm. See how BQE Core can transform your practice by clicking the link in our show notes. So after you finished the program, you did that competition, which Aldo Rossi's, and you and your team, the team won.
right.
So then right after school, did you work with him, or did you work somewhere else first, or?
So yeah, I did that competition, and then while I was there, because I stayed for a year, we did a competition in Genoa for a new opera house. The opera house was designed, and the whole piazza was designed by an architect, Carlo Barabino. And there was there was a building that remained, and the opera house was bombed, and it was damaged at the end of World War II, but they sort of demoed it and just left sort of the pediment and 4 columns in the front, and it was like a ruin for literally 40 years. And they had 3 competitions over those 40 years, and the Italian organization and the machinations of, the way things work there, nothing ever happened. And then finally there was a builders competition, and Aldo was on the team, and I worked on that project, and they won that project as well. And after that is when I left. But I stayed in touch. I went back, I finished school, I moved back to New York. I was working for a small firm, doing residential work. And then Aldo called me and said he was coming to town. And he stopped in, we said hello, we had dinner. And then he went to Miami to give a lecture. When he came back, he said, they want me to design the School of Architecture. Do you want to help us with it? We need an American, to help with, all of the logistics and, obviously the design, but also just the client relationship. Mm-hmm. And so we did a design. I took a leave of absence, flew to Milan. We worked on the project. We presented it. They said, we love it. We're going to build it. but then nothing really ever happened. We opened the office thinking that we were going to do that project, and they couldn't raise the money. And then I ended up helping or going to Japan with Aldo for a project, and then we ended up doing that project, which was Il Palazzo, and we did 10 other projects out of the New York office after that.
Wow.
Wow. Wait, so how long was the New York office? It sounds like it was established and started with you.
Yeah.
How long was it around before it ended?
Almost exactly 10 years. I mean,
Wow.
it sort of, we opened the office in 87, and Aldo died in 97. So that was 10 years. But I sort of developed my office simultaneously with finishing 4 projects that we had started with Aldo.
Gotcha.
And one of them was Scholastic. There was a hotel in Japan, a project for Disney in Florida, and a ABC headquarters in Burbank.
Gotcha. The hotel in Japan was the Il Palazzo.
Actually, it was a project in Nara. We had finished the Il Palazzo project in like 89 or something.
Gotcha. I mean, all of these are just anyone who's listening. If you're not familiar, you should look up their work. These are all like phenomenal projects.
Thank you.
You know what I mean? They're not like just casual projects.
Yeah.
They're all heavy hitters.
Yeah.
Did you? Unfortunately, he had an untimely passing. I didn't know it was a car accident, which is like horrific.
Well, it certainly was horrific. He didn't die in the accident. He died about actually almost 2 weeks later. That was his 3rd major accident. He had an accident in the 70s in what was Yugoslavia at the time, and he was laid up in a hospital, and he conceived the cemetery. He was involved at the time in the design for a competition for the San Cataldo cemetery in Modena, and sort of envisioned that as like the skeleton shape, I guess meditating on his mortality or something, but ended up winning that competition. And then he was involved in another accident, so it was like the 3rd one ended up being the one that he died from.
Wow. Did you think that did you always know that you would have your own office? I mean, even when he was alive, like separate from him, or?
I mean, it was no. I mean, I never thought about it. And the funny thing is, I was finishing up the projects, and I was doing a lot of interior work at the time, a lot of ad agencies, which were great clients because they had big budgets and they really wanted special, a statement and a great space. And so, focus on the public spaces and interaction spaces was great. And I was, the office was Aldo Rossi Studio di Architettura, which means it's like architecture office. It's like very generic, Studio di Architettura. I was going to continue the name of the practice as just SDA, Studio di Architettura, because nobody could actually spell it. And then one day I got a call from Wing Chow. He was a master planner and sort of the director of design at Disney, who I'd worked with. And he said, I'm going to be, he lived in LA.
I think I might have met that guy. Is he still around?
He is still around. I mean, he's sort of emeritus now, but he's still very tangentially involved. But he was really involved in everything that Disney did, through the 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s. And he said, I'm going to be in town. I want to come see you. I was like, sure, come on by. So he's like, Morris, I like you, and I respect what you do. What are you doing now that Aldo's gone? And I was like, well, I'm doing these projects and finishing this up. And he goes, well, what about the name of the company? He said, well, I said, I haven't done anything yet. I'm thinking of just continuing Studio de Arquitectura. And he's like, no, you need to put your name on it. I was like, what? He goes, you need to, make your name known and be, the name on the door or whatever it was. And it was for me, it was a really special moment that somebody came to see me that really thought about my career and gave me advice as to what he thought would be the way to carry on. And in a way, Aldo's legacy, I think, lives through what we do. And I really value that. And it's the foundation for the practice. But, I'm doing something different, and it's, not, playing, Aldo's greatest hits still.
Sure.
And,
Sure.
and,
Of course,
and,
of course.
and I think it really, the idea of changing the name reset my mindset as to, what I was doing and how I would, continue.
Yeah. I mean, it makes one. I'm kind of surprised that Wing Chao was the person you mentioned, because I had a phone call with him like 3 years ago about a small potential project thing, but which is like a super random connection. Like really, really, I would have never thought that name would come up ever again in my life. Like what? But it makes sense, that it would be, the office would be named after you. And of course, if we're looking at the timelines, it's been almost 30, coming up on 30 years, for your practice, and the body of work you've produced in that period is the volume, in addition to the quality, is like tremendous, and it takes on its own life, definitely. Talking a bit about the office itself, so I'm curious. So there's a few things. The one is like how big is your office? Like how many employees do you guys have? Because I think it might be bigger than people think. And you also offer a wide range of services. It's not strictly traditional architecture as a kind of narrow niche.
Yeah, I think that it's grown organically, just in terms of size, but also in terms of what we do and how we do it. I think that the more of the project we touch, I think the better the project can be, in the sense that we can create a holistic experience. We started as an architecture firm. We added interiors because I think interior designers think very differently than architects, and I think that working together informs both and helps to make a more unified statement, but also experience. And so that was a natural, I think, growth. But a lot of the projects we work on were multi-parcel projects, and then we were called in and we have done a lot of planning. District planning over the years. And so sort of by, just being in the room, we started looking at planning. And so we do that. So as part of the services that we provide, but what we do interiors, FF&E, and the most recent sort of growth is art services, and that grew out of a program that we have in the office for exhibitions, and helping our clients select art that started just with a few pieces and then building wide, and now we're doing. We won an RFP to do the art selection for a hospital that's being designed by Herzog and de Meuron in San Francisco. So.
Wow.
We're doing projects in buildings that we haven't even designed, which I think is great.
That's very
really
interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
Do you guys still? I mean, most of your projects are still in New York City, right?
I would say most of our projects completed are in New York, but we're in believe it or not, about 20 cities.
Wow.
So, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Charlotte, Charleston, Tampa, Miami, New Orleans, L.A., Berkeley, Chicago. So.
And then how many people do you have at your office now?
We have probably about
Approximately.
70, a little over 70 probably combined.
That's really good size.
Yeah.
I'm always curious also, do you, I think you mentioned you grew organically, and I assume the word organic would apply to whatever happens in the future, but do you like being about that size? Do you prefer being smaller or bigger? Have you found it's challenging to be bigger?
No, it is challenging to be bigger. And we were bigger at one point. And, through COVID and just a lot of people moved. There was a lot of remote work, which I think is not great. And I don't think that what we do is, there are certain aspects of what we do that are, can be done remotely, but design, I think, is a got to be in the room kind of thing. So I'm happy that we're, more or less back. We're here 4 days a week in person. A lot of people are here every day like me, but most of the design is done around a table. And that was one of the biggest things I did sort of coming out of COVID was focusing on a more analog experience in the office to, trying to mark up a design, on Zoom. It takes a half hour to do something that takes like 1 minute, in person.
Yeah, I know. You got to find the pen tool's missing. It's like you don't have the right colors and all this kind of. And so then actually talking about I used to call it analog versus digital, and at the beginning of the conversation, I think you touched on the positives of having that tactile and direct experience in response to drawing things by hand. Obviously, now so much of the work, especially work done by the younger generations, fresh graduates and millennials, is heavily done in the computer. I don't know if I have a question really, but I don't know. I guess how do you negotiate those differences in an office? I mean, because I think it's easy for people who are really skilled, even if they're really skilled in a computer, to be kind of sucked into that space when they really need to be kind of just a step away for like 5 minutes even sometimes. Yeah,
I feel guilty as being a person that sort of fueled the, dependence on computers, which I don't think that was a force that you couldn't have held back. But I remember the first computer we put in the office, and I convinced Aldo to put one in Milan as well. And he's like, "Those drawings are horrible," and they were doing drawings, on vellum with ink and erasing with a razor blade. That's the sort of, it's like the next thing you know, they'll be carving on a tablet, and so I start to sound like, I used to complain to him, like, this is something that's coming and you can't avoid it. And, there are some things that you can't do by hand. And there's some things that are really great on the computer. And I think, we 3D print models and details of models and connections and, visualization. We were showing a client, the difference between 40 feet and 50 feet between a building. And we could create, that experience virtually and say, like, it's like not that big of a difference, but the compromise that you have to make to do the 50 really impacted the overall design. And so we ended up, it helped to make a decision. So those kind of things are great. I kind of depend on a pencil, and I'm always sketching. And every time I have a meeting, I'm folding paper to overlap things, or like the origami, experience, taking two drawings to cut and paste, things, or sketching directly on them. I feel like, sometimes I'll ask them, can you sketch this out? And I get this finished looking drawing done on a computer. I'm like, that's not a sketch, And that is my biggest complaint, it's like, I think we need to embrace the technology, because certainly, I mean, and I've found recently that clients and even general public react much more genuine. They're more connected to like hand done drawings or sketches than they are to super photorealistic renderings. Because I think that craft shows in a drawing, and so we're sort of doing both. And I think it depends on the client or the point of the presentation, but a lot of times you can show a sketch, watercolor, whatever, and that sort of evokes more of a feeling and a mood and sort of a direction than something that's totally worked out that takes so much more time to get right that you can't get it right early, and you potentially lose opportunity.
Yeah, that's a really good description, because with how, so let's say we're talking about perspective view, with how you have to work in a computer, and they have fantastic rendering software now where it renders in a matter of seconds, literally, but you're still, it's still flat in the sense that the computer is generally not great at allowing you to be suggestive, like just to have kind of a sketch, like a sketched corner of it, and be like, this, something's going to go over here. It's a line. I don't know what the line is,
right?
But something. They can't really do that in a computer rendering. It all has to be filled in, like equally weighted.
And it also has to be designed, like, the rendering looks great, but like, what's that? What's the corner? What's the depth? What's the angle? How does it all come together? And how do you get a sense of a building when you haven't really worked all those things out?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm just thinking about that. It's tough. It's tough. And then also, even if you do manage to do it, with like the people hours you manage to slam it in, it still sometimes creates it's kind of disruptive to the overall design process internally as an office, as an architect, but also design process with the clients, because now in some ways you've jumped way forward beyond where you are if you're in like early schematic design phase, for example.
Right. And also they see a drawing and they say, that's what it's going to look like. And you're like, well, sort of, but we haven't really worked everything out yet. So even though it looks really finished, it's just an approximation of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Which, hearing that, actually, now I can understand why clients would be like, what the hell does that mean?
Right.
So what in this image am I supposed to look at, and what am I supposed to ignore exactly?
Right.
I'm assuming you're not using rapidographs and razor blading lines, though, in your office.
No. I use a paper-made flare pen, for the most part. So
nice. With all the different projects you've done, is there a particular building type or projects that you have not done that you would like to do?
Yes. We've done, a tremendous amount of multifamily, hospitality. Those two overlap and they influence each other, and that's been great. We've done some great boutique office buildings like the Samsung building or 520 West 20th Street, which sort of is an addition, which hovers over the brick base.
Is that sorry to interrupt, is that the one that it's a sort of a black steel grid cube that's twisted? Or is that a different
Samsung.
Project?
That's the Samsung.
That's Samsung.
Yeah,
okay.
That's Samsung. Yeah. And then there's one on 20th Street, which has like it's a Varendale truss, but it's a black steel addition on top. It sort of floats on top of an existing brick building. There are a bunch of galleries and some finance companies in there. Sorry, I got lost on the question.
It's all good. Reminiscing about projects.
The buildings typology that we like to. I am very passionate about art, and obviously we have this program. We're doing that. I've done a number of exhibition designs. I did one at the Museo del Novecento, which is a museum of the 20th century in Milan. It was a exhibition of Aldo Rossi's design products. So, all the furniture and tableware that he did for Molteni and the products for Alessi and a couple other companies, Longoni, Unifor, Rosenthal. and that was really satisfying to do this exhibition design, which really sort of transformed this space. And I think, I would like to do a museum or a gallery. That's something that I think would be challenging, but also really satisfying. And it's a public building that brings people together. So I think it's something that I'd like to see. Unfortunately didn't get shortlisted. We did the competition for the Helsinki project, which was great. And it was also really nice for the team to work on it.
Are you guys doing a lot of competitions?
I would say we don't do a lot. We do a fair amount of like we'll get invited by developers to do a competition. And we've done a number of those and have been successful in that. We try to do some type of competition, I would say 1 or 2 a year, but we're not doing a lot.
Because I was also curious because typically speaking, they're tough.
They are tough.
Financially for offices to do. It's a lot of work.
It's a tremendous amount of work, and I think that there are definite benefits of doing the competition. I think you get to sort of stretch your design, arms or whatever, and I think it's helpful to keep the team positive, and there's a certain amount of hope and energy that you put into it that I think does foster great thinking, and eventually hopefully gets incorporated into projects, but it's very taxing.
Is there a project that your office has done that maybe stands out as the most complex one in whatever way that means?
Most complex? I think they're all hard.
That's a good answer. If you do it right, they're all hard.
Well, they're all challenging, and I think for different reasons. I think that, it could be the client, has unrealistic expectations, or, there's opposition from the community. We did a project in Crown Heights, and there was a lot of opposition, I think, for the wrong reasons. The project turned out really, really great, and I think people are generally happy with the project. But yeah, it's challenging. I think that's one of the things that we have learned over the course of, we have probably over 40 projects that were approved by Landmarks Preservation Commission, and those are difficult, not so much because it's the Landmarks Commission. It's more the entitlements process of meeting with stakeholders and the community boards and elected officials and everybody. Democracy is messy, and everybody has an opinion, and working through some of those can be challenging.
Sort of along the same lines of what you just said, it also reminded me, given the size of your office and how many employees you have, like one of the things I'm always curious about is that when an office is founded and led by an individual, how does that architect's philosophy and design skills get passed on or taught basically to other people in the office? Because there's no way you could scale to being 70 people and produce high quality work across the board if that transference of information, of skill set, of design thinking doesn't take place somehow. And it's interesting because if I think back to the earlier part of the conversation about architecture working in an urban setting and being responsive to this context and whatnot, it seems like there's something tangible there that clearly has been, I guess, taught would be the word, or disseminated to the people you work with. Has that been a challenge? Like, what is that like? Is it difficult? Was it easy? Is it something you're conscious of, or did it just happen?
I'm definitely conscious of it. I'm also more focused on it now as to try and set the path for succession. I'm still very active. I'm involved in every project in different ways, and I don't see that ending immediately, but I also am trying to put in place people that can carry on and do what I'm doing in different ways, whether it's client contact or design, or just even office culture. I'm sort of, those are three areas I'm really involved in. And I think, in terms of scale, I think we have a great team. It might sound cliche, but have a couple of really, really great designers that, and it's a collaborative, process. And I think I'm comfortable working in different ways. So some projects I might just be editing or suggesting or questioning the 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 concept, the idea, or details. We've done a lot, like during COVID, we had some downtime, and there were a lot of things I wanted to do over the years that we never did. So we had some extra time. So we cataloged all of the projects and did sort of like drawings of every facade and dimensioned all of that information so people could look at that and say, oh, that's what, 2 feet or whatever, 60 centimeters looks like. These are the flange sizes, or this is the depth of that facade. And so that's helped. We've done other libraries of information of what we've done. But I think sometimes I'll come up with the initial idea. Sometimes, it'll be more of a work session where we say, okay, well, here, like we're doing a project now, we did recently for a potential client, and hopefully they like the idea. And there was an existing building, and we decided, through these work sessions to basically gut the building and leave the entire facade and create this outdoor space with the building adjacent to it. And so that came through a discussion of some options for massing and how we could maintain the connection to the existing, but then do something that was new and fresh. And so, it's kind of it depends on the particular instance and the design, how my involvement affects the overall outcome.
Yeah. That makes total sense. One of the the final questions we always like to ask, sometimes it's the most challenging, is what is your favorite building? And it doesn't have to be one of your own, and it doesn't have to be one of all the Rossi's, or it could be, but what is your favorite building?
I'm gonna take the easy way out. I'm gonna say there are 3 buildings or spaces that, for me, I keep coming back to. I'm going to go on a slight tangent, but I'll bring it back, I think. So one of the artists that I've become very good friends with, his name's Matthias Van Arkel. He's Swedish. He did an installation in a friend of mine's apartment, and I told her, I said, I really like this artwork, and she goes, oh, that's my friend Matthias. I can introduce you to him. And that was about 12, 13 years ago, and we connected, and then I was like, I'd like to, maybe one day use some of your work in a building. And about a year later, I called him up and I said, we're doing this project in DC, and I'm really going on a tangent here. Maybe you could do that. And he does this sort of spray paint, almost like Bryce Martin. And I said, I don't want to use wall covering or just paint. And so he did this installation where he painted this sort of graffiti pattern, a different pattern with different colors on every floor. And then we got to be friends. And then he did an installation of his primary work, which is silicone folded and bent. And it really creates sort of a painting, but it's dimensional, made out of silicone. And so I recently, then I was working on the Aldo show, and then I was like, I've been saying I'm going to come visit you. I'm going to be in Milan. That's close enough. I'm going to come. And I went to see one of my favorite architects' buildings while I was there, Asplund, and I spent almost a whole day at the Woodland Cemetery. And I was fortunate in that there was a Leverance who Asplund and Leverance did that project together, exhibition on at this time at Design Deck. And so it was just like the most moving experience I could have. I mean, seeing those buildings, but also just that Woodland Cemetery is just it's the most poetic and special place I've been. Other buildings, the Alhambra in Granada, and the Pantheon in Rome. Those are all historic buildings. So I sort of took the easy way out. I didn't talk about any new buildings.
No, those are great ones, and we'll try and insert images of those and all those things we talked about into the video. Do you have any final questions, Verena? That's usually the last one. I don't know if we have
that
anything
was
else on
the
your
last
list.
question.
Okay.
If that's it, then thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate
Thank
it,
you.
Morris. We're so happy to have you on. Thanks for taking the time, and hopefully we can stay in touch. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you like what we're doing, then please support the show by leaving us a review in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube and all other podcast players. On social media, we're mostly on Instagram, so you can follow us on there, where we post a lot of video clips, announcements, work images, quotes. That's like all you can really post on Instagram. So that's what we post on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
What else do we have going on? We have a hotline, so you can reach out to us. You can call the hotline and leave a voicemail or a text message, and the number is 213-222-6950. Anything else?
No, I mean, we have the website, secondstudiopod.com. You can find all of the episodes on there, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. So if you guys have any, guest suggestions, thoughts, whatever else, hit us up. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.